Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the second story from chapter 47 of the Road to Latin textbook. Now this story is called De Helvetiorum Profectione, and it's talking about the departure of the Helvetii, right? We're seeing how they leave, the planned migration. And like I've been telling you, these last chapters are really book one of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. They've just been adapted to fit the Road to Latin curriculum. So before we dive too far into it, like I always tell you, whenever you're reading the stories, you want to make sure that you always start with a really strong foundation of the vocab. Now, this is the second story, so I'm going to assume that you know the vocab, but in case you need it, you can always get a refresher on my website. You can take a look, find a bunch of resources there, whether it's a Quizlet or just the vocab list or GIM kits or Blue kits, whatever you might need to practice. Always start with the vocab just because it's really hard to understand what's going on if you don't know what the words mean. The other thing that you want to have at this point, as you go into the second story, is you want to have a really good grasp of the grammar, right? So you already got to see it in the first story. You got to practice the grammar and context. Now you want to bring that all back and use the second story to really perfect what we're doing here and make sure you understand it really well. So if you haven't done that yet, make sure you've read through all the grammar, all the notes, any videos you can find on my website. Like I said, you can find all that stuff. Just make sure you have a really strong foundation of it. Then when it comes time to read the story, I always recommend that you read it out loud. So find someone in class, maybe it's a classmate, someone that you can read it to work on your speaking and your pronunciation, and then they can read it back to you. You can work on your listening skills. You never want to shut these off. They're always a great way to make sure that you're understanding the language, and you never know. You might be someone who just learns better by speaking and listening rather than doing it in your head, right? Latin's a language. You should treat it that way. You don't want to just always be living in your head trying to read and translate. So bring it to life. Have some fun with it. And, like I said, work on your pronunciation. The other thing that I always recommend is do the read and reread method. So when it comes time to actually translate the story, you want to read through it all the way, start to finish, and write down any problem areas that you have as you go. When you're done with the read, you want to look over your problem areas and see where you went wrong. If it's vocab, it's pretty easy to fix. Just look the words up and you'll be fine. If it's grammar, it's probably from this chapter's grammar, so you can look it over and just try to see where you're making your mistakes. If it's something that's not in this chapter, maybe you're forgetting like a verb form, something like that, you want to take some time and try to figure out what you're looking at and try to shore up those problem areas so that when you read the story again on the second or third time, whatever it is, your list should be getting smaller and smaller and smaller until you're able to read the story start to finish without having any help or having to write anything down. That's how you know that you've got it mastered and you're ready to move on. Okay, so if you haven't done that yet, pause the video. Always go work on that first. But now we're going to move forward. I'll read you the story and we'll translate as we go. As long as your translation is somewhere in the general vicinity of mine, again, mine is never perfect, but it should just guide you on the path. That's how you know you're in a good place and you're ready to move on. So let's dive in. So the story goes like this. You have Helvetii multa comparaverant ut de finibus suis cum omnibus copiis exirent. Right, so we're starting with the Helvetii, right? That's our first line. So the Helvetii, they had prepared, right? So comparaverant, rather, they had prepared many things, right? Multa, so they've gotten everything ready so that they might depart, right? You have the ut clause there, right? Ut exirent, so that they might depart or leave from their own boundaries with all their troops. So de finibus suis is from their own finibus, their own boundaries, on their own lands, you could even say. And then you have cum omnibus copiis, with all their troops. So they're trying to get ready to leave. Then it continues. You have multis finitimis, quoque persuaserant, ut opidis vicisque incensis una cum eis proficiscarentor. Okay, so you have the persuaserant, right? So they persuaded, right? You could say they had persuaded. And it's quoque, so they had also persuaded many neighbors. And remember that verb of persuading takes a dative, right? They're persuasive to someone. So they had persuaded multis finitimis, many of their neighbors, so that with all their opidis vicisque incensis, with all their towns and villages having been set on fire, burned. There's your ablative absolute there, right? So with all their villages gone, they might set out together with them, right? So una cum eis, right? Together with them, they might depart. Proficiscarentor. Okay, so it's saying that they persuaded them to do the exact same thing that they had. So you might remember in the previous story, to really kind of get ready for leaving and really make sure that there's no hope of return. The Helvetii had lit their towns and their different villages on fire so that there's nowhere to go back. That's sort of the determination that they have. Okay? Then you have id fecerant, quo tutius per hostium fines iter facerant. faceret rather. Okay, so you're saying they had done this, right? Meaning persuaded them, right? They had done this so that they might travel more safely through the boundaries of their enemies. So id fecerant is that they had done this, so that, remember, quo is the alternate of ut, so that more safely, tutius, through the lands of their enemies, they could eat their facerant, they could make a journey. So they're trying to persuade their neighbors to come with them so that they're not in trouble on the route. They're not going to get attacked, is basically the idea. Okay? Then you have circuitas Helvetia, fluminibus montibusque, ita continebator, ut Helvetii duobis omnino itineribus, there we go, itineribus domo exire possent. Stumbling there, right? But it says, but, so they get all these different neighbors on their side and they're finally ready to go. You have, but the Helvetian state, right? The civitas Helvetia, the Helvetian state was so contained, cotinebantor, right? So it was so confined, you might even say, by rivers and mountains, fluminibus montibusque. So by the rivers and mountains, it's so contained that the Helvetii were able to leave home, right? That they, exire posan, right? They were able to leave home by only two paths, right? So the home there is the domo, omnino itineribus duobis, right? So the two paths are all they can take. So this is referring back to the geography that we've been talking about of the Helvetians and where they live, but it's contained in such a way, you might say, or it's so contained that they only have two ways that they can go, right? There's only so many directions that they can leave their lands, and we're going to see what those ways are. So now it continues. And you have unum per sequanorum fines, alterum per provinciam Romanam pertinebat. So one of those paths, right, unum, one path extended, right? So you have pertinebat, right? It kind of extended through the fines sequanorum, through the lands of the Sequani. Okay, the other alterum here, so one goes through the land of Sequani, the other extended, you could say, through the Roman province, right? So per provinciam Romanum. So this is the problem that the Helvetii have. On which path are they going to take? One is going to go through Sequani land, the other one is going to go through the Roman province, right? Roman land. Then you have iter autem per sequanorum fines inter montem iorum et flumen Rodanum erat tam angustum ut sine maxima difficultate Helvetii iter facere non possent. Okay, so now we're getting a little more of a description of what's going on. So you have the journey, right, the iter, the journey through the boundaries or the borders of the Sequani, right, the fines sequanorum. However, between the Montem Iorum, the Jura Mountains, so this is a mountain range of the Alps, right, sort of a northern spur of the Alps. So the Jura Mountains and the Rhone River, the Flumen Rodanum, it was so narrow, right, so erat tam angustam, right, these result clauses coming at you, it was so narrow that the Helvetii were not able to make a journey, right? So non possent iter facere, they're not able to make a journey without the greatest difficulty. So sine maxima difficultate. So the route through the Sequani lands goes through the Jura Mountains. It's the northern route if you're looking at a map. So that area is so so narrow, that path, that it's not impossible, but it'd be very difficult to go through there, and they lose a lot of people. So that's part of the problem. Okay. Then you end with this line. You have veriti sunt autem ne pauci hostes itinere prohibere possent. Okay, so they feared, and the book gives you a note here that when you have the verbs of fearing followed by a substantive clause, you have that subjunctive introduced by ne, or ut or ne non for the negative, right? So this is basically like a fearing clause. So it says they feared, however, that few enemies. So again, the pauci hostes. So they were afraid, or they feared, that few enemies, or a few enemies, you might say, were able to prohibit the journey, right? Itinere prohibere possent. So their fear is that because it's so narrow, they'd be blocked by only a few enemies, pauci hostes, right? It wouldn't take a lot of people to block them from getting over this route. So that's not really their best bet. So then it continues, and you have said iter per provinciam Romanam erat multo facilius quod inter fines Helvetiorum et Allobrogum qui erant soci Romanorum Rodanus fluit. Okay, so we have a little bit of a longer line here, but it says, but the journey, the iter, through the Roman province, the Provinciam Romanum, right? So that second option, it was much easier, right? So you have multo facilius, right? Easier by a lot or by much, right? The abla there. So it was much easier because between the boundaries of the Helvetii and the Allobroges, right? So between those boundaries, and it's the Allobroges who were allies of the Romans, qui erat socii Romanorum, right? They're Roman allies. The Rhone River flowed, the Rhodanus fluid, okay? So it's saying that this is going to be an easier journey because you have the Rhone River going through it. Then it continues as to why this is an easier route. You have Helvetii sciverant se id flumen paucis locis vado transire posse. So the Helvetii knew, sciverant, right? So they knew that they were able to cross, right? So you have they were able to cross it. It's the indirect statement of the knowing, right? The head verb sets this up. So transire posse is what you're looking at. That they were able to cross over that river, right? Id flumen, at a few shallow places. So you have paucis locis vado, right? A few places of the shallows, right? So here it's saying that they're fine going over the Rhone River because they know that there are shallow spots where they'll be able to make it over, right? So it's just in general an easier journey for them. Then you have sic speraverunt se iter per provinciam Romanam facere posse. Okay, so thus, or because of all this, right, thus they hoped, speraverunt, right, another indirect statement here, they hoped that they they were able to make a journey, right? So they hoped that they, iter facere posse, that they were able to make a journey through the Roman province, per provinciam Romanam. Right, so they're hoping that because they have the river and they can cross over, it'll be easier than going through, the much more difficult route across the Jura Mountains with all their people. Then you have the last line here. You have his rebus fiebat ut Helvetii facilius iter deligerent rather. Okay, so through these things, right, his rebus fiebat, through these things, it happened that, right? So it just so happened that, with all these things going on, or because of all these things, you might say, the Helvetii chose or easily chose a journey, right? So they facilius iter deligerent. So they chose the easier journey, easily chose the journey because they know, hey, this is, we got two options here, and this one is going to be much easier to do than the other, right? So they make their choice. They're going to go through the Roman province. Now we have the last paragraph. You have Allobroges a Romanis nuper victi erant, itaque Helvetii credebant eos nondum bono animo in populum Romanum esse. Okay, so the Allobroges, remember, these are the neighbors that are the Roman ally. Okay, so it says the Allobroges, having been conquered, victi erant, right? They had been conquered nuper recently by the Romans. So they're not exactly the best of friends here. And Caesar tells us this. It's not that they're such great allies. They were only recently conquered, right? So they don't really love the Romans, right? So it's saying they had recently been conquered by the Romans. And so, itaque, the Helvetii believed, or they were believing, they thought, credebant, they thought that they, again, indirect statement, the eos there is talking about the Allobroges, that they no longer were bono animo, literally like in a good mind, you might say, but were well thought of, you might even say, among the Roman people, the populum Romanum. So in other words, they didn't have a good state of mind, right? They didn't have good thoughts towards the Romans because they were just recently conquered. And another way to do the in populus Romanos, or in populum Romanum rather, might be like towards them. So in other words, they were not in a good state of mind towards the Roman people, might be a better way to do in populum Romanum. But the idea is they don't think the Allobroges actually like the Romans because they were recently conquered by them, right? So that's kind of what they're banking on. Then you have ex opido extremo Allobrogum genawa nomine ad Helvetiorum fines pons pertinebat. Okay, so you have from the farthest or the far off town, right, or from a far off town of the Allobroges, right? So Allobrogum, it's called Geneva, right? Genawa nomine. So this far off town known as Geneva, which again we're talking modern day Switzerland, that's what it is. From this town, a bridge extended. So our subject is really pons here, right? So a bridge extended pertenebat to the lands of the Helvetii, the Helvetiorum Fines, from this far off town. So in other words, what they're saying is there's a bridge across the river that goes between Geneva, right, of the Allobroges, and the lands of the Helvetii. So this is where they're going to try to cross, right, over the bridge. Why not? So it's banking on the idea that the Allobroges actually don't like the Romans, right, and they have this bridge. Then it continues. You have Helvetii existimabant se Allabrogibus persuasuros esse ut persuos finis eos ire patarentur. Okay, so the Helvetii, they judged, or they thought, you might say, existimabant. So they thought that, or they judged that, that they might allow them they thought that, not allowing, skipping a little bit, they thought that they might be able to persuade, that's where we want to start, the persuasuros esse, they might be able to persuade the Allobroges, right, the Allobroges, so that they might allow, patarento, they might endure or allow them, eos, to go, ire, through their borders, persuos finis, through their own borders. So in other words, they're hoping that they're going to be able to persuade the Allobroges, who might not really love the Romans, to let them through, right, across this bridge. That's what the Helvetii are really hoping here, right? Lean into the fact that they don't like the Romans and they'll let them cross the bridge. Then you have the last part here. So you have itaque nuntios qui eas res conficerent mitere constituerunt, sed Caesar effecit ut consilia exequi non posset. Okay, so, and again, they're trying to convince the Allobroges, right? And so they decided, right? Constituent, they decided to send messengers. Okay, so they decide to mitere nuntios, to send out messengers who might accomplish these things, qui eares conficerent, right? So in other words, the messengers might be able to do these things. So they want to persuade the Allobroges, they send out some messengers, and they're hoping that they can figure everything out. Okay, but, right, and there's a big but at the end, but Caesar, right, affected, he did this so that they were not able to follow these plans. So in other words, Caesar steps in here, affected, right, he's going to interrupt this and prevent them, right, is kind of the idea, from carrying out these plans. So he's going to prevent them so that they're not able to follow these plans. So in other words, they have this great plan, they're ready to go, but now Caesar's about to step in. So we're setting up in this story, you can already see, we're setting up the conflict that's about to happen between the Helvetii, who have, through all the nonsense they've dealt with, or Gadarex, all these things, they've finally gotten